Yeah, I would just like to open the floor a bit for our final 15 minutes or so before the break, just for some questions, if anybody has any. Anyone? Yeah, Kieran. I will unmute you here. I think this just seems to not be working. I'm really sorry about this.
Okay,
are you
working now?
cool? Okay.
Thanks so much. That's great. That was an absolutely fascinating panel. Thank you so much to everyone involved. My question was for you, Roisin. I really enjoyed that discussion. Well, not enjoyed, it was, it's not my area, so I was enlightened by it, and it was so in-depth, it was brilliant. I was really interested in, or I was intrigued by your discussion of how communities who are living in border areas, that their kind of normative legal standards and rights can become more elusive in those zones, or more flexible, or however, whatever the language might be. But I wondered, excuse me, whether you felt that this was a pattern or a particular kind of set of power relations that exists primarily on the margins or on the borders of states, or whether we can see similar patterns within states. So I'm thinking of direct provision centers, for example, like where there's kind of private companies with state contracts, and obviously there have been cases of human rights abuses or issues kind of raised in relation to those spaces, but I'm not sure if I'm making sense, but
Oh yeah, there we go. Sorry, I was told I couldn't unmute myself. Yeah, so absolutely, I suppose it's interesting in that the patterns you see at borders tend to be indicative of underlying, I suppose, power preferences within the states themselves, which manifest in kind of contested spaces always. So direct provision is a really good example. I have a colleague who's working on a project which maps, I suppose, the creation of specifically police geographies in the North Inner City. So there's, when you actually kind of lay it down on a map, like about 15-foot wall and a very consistent use of CCTV and geographic structures as well through the North Inner City that separates what continue to be council-owned properties from private developments. And the more private developments are created, the higher the walls have tended to get and the more CCTV which has appeared. So I think you're right, it's kind of interesting to understand who we police, and even within territories which are, you know, nominally within the state entirely and do not exist in borders, there are still bordered communities. Yeah, so I mean, the short answer is yes, so they do exist. I think there are interesting examples as well from kind of northern India, and somebody may be able to specifically correct me on the language here, but there are kind of statelets within northern India in which small political groups have citizenship of their own state, but they are contained sort of within a citizenship island, so they don't retain citizenship of the state around them, and effectively are stateless in that to receive citizenship of India, they would need to travel beyond the territory they're entitled to occupy to obtain documents, and they effectively exist in kind of a citizenship paradox as a result. So we have kind of, I suppose, rights-bound examples of it in this jurisdiction and within Europe, and there are kind of geography-bound ones elsewhere. Yeah, thank you though.
Thanks.
I see, Katrina, you've raised your hand. I will just ask to unmute you there.
Thank you very much. That was a great panel. My question really just follows on from Kieran's. I'm wondering, is it a bit conspiratorial to follow the logic of what Roisin described so clearly? Because Roisin, your focus is in the kind of border regions, what's happening there. But as I sort of stared into the horror of what you described there, I was thinking, actually, you know, what you describe as a system where thinking this through is the disappearance of the border itself entirely, and the disappearance of a thing called the law, the place where law happens in a visible way. You get checked, you can cross from one space to another, or you're held at that space and told, thou shalt not. That actually the logic of this is that all of that disappears because the border, the surveillance happens elsewhere. So as that kind of what you're describing as life in the border region actually over time stretches further and further and further back, to such an extent that it actually, the border then becomes everywhere, and means that you don't actually have to have that, what we would call the border now at all. So it is not there, it is invisible, it is no longer the exception, the threshold of the law, the state of exception, but the exception is normalized, and that really is a kind of a horror.
Sorry.
Oh yeah, okay, there we are. Yeah, thanks so much, Katrina. It's actually, that's a really interesting idea, and actually now I'm going to admit one I hadn't thought about, but you're absolutely right, because if we remove, so there's kind of a historical idea that law has a very specific geography, right, that we think about like Norse law in Ireland, that it has a geographic place, it has a rock where the law happens, so that as we began to, I suppose, disentangle law from geography, that it is effectively nowhere and everywhere, and that we all have a kind of dissolution of the rights conflict within broader communities. It's a really interesting idea, and I think there's something in that the like contested space becomes everywhere, which I mean arguably you see in the northern US, where the spaces within which migrant identities are suspect has become increasingly large, such that it's not just the border states now, it is effectively like up into California and further north, where those kind of integrated technologies that are used in cooperation with private actors operate. So there is no kind of safe space beyond which you can flee a border territory. Effectively, the whole jurisdiction becomes the border. But yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much. I hadn't thought about it, but it's absolutely accurate, yeah.
Thank you both so much. Thank you all so far for such interesting questions. And I see just Callum has a question here too.
Thank you so much for that like amazing like combination of talks. They were so interesting. I think they worked together really nicely. I've got a question. I don't know who this would really be most suited to. I guess it could be Swed, or all of you might have input on this. But I was just thinking about this tension between, on one level, from a kind of literature or cultural perspective, this idea of liminality and thresholds has really emerged, and this desire, which I think is completely right, to try and muddy things and complicate, and as you were talking about, the losing guitar, kind of have that hybridization and understanding and towards the post-national. But on the other hand, that seems to be in conflict with an increasing legalistic hardening of borders, and a hardening in discourse, and a desire to control and kind of separate. And I suppose I was just trying to think through how can we bridge that gap between, say, the cultural literary studies aspect of this embrace of liminality and this increasing kind of nation state driven legal framework in the global north, but also in places like India, towards, towards a hardening, and how those two disciplines might be able to, I suppose, talk to each other. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a complex question, but so anyway, I'd be interested to hear any of your thoughts.
I suppose I could go first, since I was unmuted first, I suppose. Just by sheer practicality of that. I find that really interesting, actually, because I have always found that the more the law gets hard, so to say, like you said, or the more codified it gets, or the more, I suppose we see this more with states that, particularly with states that are going so towards the populist right-wing narrative, and that's translating into their laws. I actually find there's more liminal spaces within the law because there's only so much legislation can legislate, you know? There's only so much, I mean, if the intention of a country or of the government of that country or whatever is to isolate people or to discriminate against them or to privilege certain groups versus others, states can try and legislate on every aspect of how to privilege certain groups over others, but there's always going to be like tangents that come that sort of split away, and there's only so much you can do. And we do see that. Then that's where I feel like the conflict has been coming from observing what's been happening in India over the last few years, with the US, with the UK post Brexit. One of the biggest problems I feel like what the UK is doing is, and I felt that with my paper, so there was an entire segment of my paper that I didn't actually present because it's so up in the air at the moment, which is the UK's laws vis-a-vis the asylum seekers. And because the UK has different guidance reports for each different community from different countries, as do a lot of countries, to be able to assess whether a group or somebody, an individual, is worthy of being given international protection. And it's in flux because what the UK is trying to do is trying to make up for all the laws that no longer exist because of Brexit, and that it needs to fill the gap, so to speak. And the more it tries to fill that gap, the more loopholes are coming up, the more of those liminal spaces are being created. And so I don't know if that answers your question, Callum, but I just find it interesting that I don't actually think that dichotomy exists, so to say. I do think that the liminal spaces left within the law are not perhaps the desirable ones that might exist within literature and art, for example, but definitely I don't think that dichotomy exists. I find the intersection or the relationship between them increasing more and more, actually, in a sense.
Yeah, I think Sahar is right. And I think if you look at, I mean, even controversial, but the mother and baby home report that came out in the last couple of weeks, if you look at that, it's essentially an exercise in exposing the way in which the law is an expert in creating liminal spaces, including to solve its problems, and usually to solve its problems. So you carve away small bits of the problem and ostensibly say that they belong to this easily resolvable category, and therefore kind of increasingly, I suppose, marginalize the remaining portions of that problem or that narrative. But I think you see in that report like an excellent exposure of the idea that the law can resolve liminal narratives in particular, and contested narratives, that there is some, I suppose, like narrative of truth to be determined, and that the law can resolve those areas of conflict very easily and resolve them into distinct categories of belonging. So I think Sarah's right. Yeah, it's the harder the law gets, the more difficult it becomes to say that it has adequately encapsulated all the areas of contest.
Would anyone like to respond to that question? I would like, just before we stop, to also just quickly get Robert to ask his question, but just before we move on, just wanted to check everybody had said all they want to on that. Okay, perfect. I'm trying to ask you to unmute. It might be being a bit slow. Sorry about this. Okay. Oh, there we go. Perfect. Yeah. Sorry.
It's not really a question. I taught at school. It was then called Southwest Texas State from 1976 until 1996. Not too far from that border between Mexico and the United States. There was almost a sense. I'm talking now about art. There was almost a sense that Rio Grande border had its own voice, its own identity, and I think about that in terms of borders. I almost have the feeling that porous borders are close to being sacred spaces, not only between countries, but, you know, we talked about, like, for example, Virginia Woolf and the waves. She's working against some border in cause and effect. I think it is a huge loss to human consciousness to put up walls along these borders. The other is right there. And when I was there, the border between the U.S. and Mexico was a lot more porous. And as I said, there was a sense that there was a voice, poetic term, voice, that use of it. There was an art that could only exist in that space. It could be understood backing up from it, but that was the place of origination of it. And it seemed very powerful. And to me, it's important to keep those places open rather than to shut them down. So.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all your ideas today. This has been just so good. Okay, so I will now, we'll be closing briefly, although the room will still be open, just for the break now for the next hour and 15, I believe, hour and a half. So we'll be back at 3:15. Just
the next hour, I think.
Oh, sorry about that. Okay, perfect.
Or the next panel will end at 3:15. Sorry, my washing machine's decided to become very, very loud all of a sudden. Yes, we have a break for 1 hour for lunch, and the next panel will be shortened slightly, or there'll be more space for our two speakers. Amelia McConville has unfortunately last minute had to pull out for health reasons, so we're very, very sorry to see that. But I'm glad to see we have Karen and Octavia here already, who'll be able to take the panel as well. So yes, we'll see everybody in 1 hour then. And of course, as Alicia said, the room's open, and if there are any questions, you can pop in and we'll be able to answer them in the chat.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.